In this video, we're going to finish out the midpoint formula worksheet on the KutaSoftware website. This is a free worksheet that you can find within the geometry section. I'll leave a link in the description below so you know how to access this free worksheet. And now, 27 and 28 are critical thinking questions. In number 27, it says, find the point that is 1/4 of the way from 2,4 to 10,8. So here are our endpoints, x1, y1, and x2, y2. So we need to find a point that is 1/4 of the way from x1, y1 to x2, y2. So we're going to start by finding the midpoint, because that is halfway from 2,4 to 10,8. So we're going to have 2 plus 10 divided by 2, comma, 4 plus 8 divided by 2. So this is going to give us our midpoint of those two endpoints. 2 plus 10 is 12, so we have 12 divided by 2. 4 plus 8 is 12, so we have 12 divided by 2. 12 divided by 2 is 6, and 12 divided by 2 is 6. So our midpoint is 6, 6. However, we're looking for the point that is 1/4 of the way from our first endpoint. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use our starting endpoint, and since we're going from 2,4, we're going to use point 2,4, and we're going to find the midpoint between 2,4 and 6, 6. So using the midpoint formula again, our new x2, y2 is 6, 6, but we're still using x1, y1. So now we're going to have 2 plus 6 all over 2, and 4 plus 6 all over 2. 2 plus 6 gives us 8, and that's over 2. 4 plus 6 gives us 10, and that's divided by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. So a point that's 1/4 of the way from 2,4 to 10,8 is 4, 5. Now let's move on to number 28. Now number 28 is a bit more complicated than number 27, because as opposed to working with quarters, which we know a quarter or a fourth is halfway between one point and the midpoint, we're working with thirds. And if we're only using the midpoint formula on this worksheet, let me quickly describe what we're going to do. So here is our line. So 1/3 of the way from this endpoint, which is given to us as 8, -1, we're going to have 0.5, -2. And this is our unknown, what we're trying to solve for. So in order to figure this out, we need to solve first for the midpoint of the line. Here is the midpoint of the line. We're not sure what that is, but I can see that the midpoint of our given endpoint, 8, -1, and our given point that's 1/3 of the way, 5, -2, occurs here. 5, -2 is the midpoint in between those lines. Look at this with fractions. I'll have 0, 6ths. My next step is 1/6. We know that 1/3 is equivalent to 2/6, so I'll write 1/3 here. And we know that 1/2 is equal to 3/6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the midpoint between 8, -1, 5, -2. I'm going to use this new point to find the midpoint of our line, knowing that this 5, -2 is the midpoint of my newly discovered point. And then finally, I'll be able to use the midpoint, which we now know, our original endpoint, and find the other endpoint of that segment. So stick with me, and I know this is a lot, but I just wanted you to see it visually so that you know step by step exactly what we're doing. So I'm going to leave the picture here, and let's start to solve. First, I want to solve for 1/6 of this entire line, and that's the midpoint between 0/6 and 2/6. So I'm using my endpoint and my point that's 1/3 of the way through. and I'm plugging those into my midpoint formula. So I'm going to add my x's, divide them by 2, add my y's, and divide them by 2 to get my new coordinate. So I have 8 plus 5 divided by 2, and then negative 1 plus negative 2 divided by 2. 8 plus 5 is 13, so I'll have 13 divided by 2. Negative 1 plus negative 2 is negative 3, and I'm dividing that by 2. So 13 halves we can rewrite as 6 1/2, and then negative 3 halves we can rewrite as negative 1 1/2. So this point is now 6 1/2 and negative 1 1/2. So now that I've gotten that point, I'm going to use that point and 5 negative 2 to solve for the midpoint of the line. So I'm going to have to solve for x sub m and y sub m. So 6 1/2 is my x sub 1, and I'm solving for my x sub 2 and y sub 2, given the midpoint of that x sub m, y sub m. So now I'm going to have 6 1/2 plus x sub 2 divided by 2 is going to equal my x coordinate of 5. And I'll also have that negative 1 1/2 plus my y coordinate, y sub 2, divided by 2 is going to equal my y midpoint, which since this is the midpoint, that's going to be negative 2. So now I'll solve for each of those. Multiplying both sides by 2, my 2's will cancel out, so I'll have 6 1/2 plus x sub 2 equals 10. Subtract 6 1/2 from both sides to get that x sub 2 is equal to 3 1/2. And then when I multiply by 2 for my y coordinate, my 2's will cancel out on my left hand side, and I'll have negative 1 1/2 plus y sub 2 equals negative 2 times 2, which is negative 4. So I'm going to add 1 1/2 to both sides. To get that y sub 2 equals negative 4 plus 1 1/2 is negative 2 1/2. So my midpoint is going to be 3 1/2, negative 2 1/2. So this is 3 1/2, negative 2 1/2. Now, look, I can use my given endpoint, my newly found midpoint, and solve for my unknown. So 8 negative 1 is going to be x sub 1, y sub 1. Our unknown is x sub 2, y sub 2. And our midpoint is going to be x sub m, y sub n. So I'll have that 8 plus x sub 2 divided by 2 equals our x coordinate 3 1/2. Let's solve for this first. I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. My 2's will cancel out, so I'll have 8 plus x sub 2, and that's going to be equal to 3 1/2 times 2, which is 7. When I subtract 8 from both sides, I get that x sub 2 equals a negative 1. And let me really quick draw lines to break up my work, so that makes it a little easier to read. So now let's solve for y. My y coordinate, negative 1 as y1, plus y sub 2, which is our unknown. When we divide that by 2, we're going to get negative 2 1/2. Multiplying both sides by 2, my 2's will cancel out on my left-hand side, and I'll be left with negative 1 plus y2, and that's going to be equal to negative 2 1/2 times 2, which is negative 5. So when I add 1 to both sides, I'll get that y2 is equal to a negative 4. So for the other endpoint, my x coordinate is negative 1 and my y coordinate is negative 4. So my other endpoint is negative 1, negative 4. And that's my solution for the last problem of this worksheet. So negative 1, negative 4 is our solution in number 28. Hopefully seeing number 28 visually and then working it out step by step, you will get an understanding of how to use and manipulate that midpoint formula. If you're still confused on any part of this worksheet, please feel free to comment below. Also, don't forget to click the like button and, while you're at it, subscribe to my channel. Doing both of those lets me know that you're finding these videos helpful and useful. And of course, it's greatly appreciated.